There comes a quiet moment in life when seeking gives way to listening, when the restless movement of the mind slows and something deeper than thought begins to make itself known. It is not dramatic, not announced with thunder, and not proven by outward signs. It is a gentle realization that what you have been searching for has never been distant, never withheld, never earned by effort. It has always been present, waiting not for achievement, but for recognition. When you truly understand what communion with God is, you stop imagining it as an act you perform and begin to experience it as a state of being. It is no longer confined to prayer at certain hours or words spoken in certain forms. It becomes an awareness that life itself is responding to an invisible presence that has always been within you. You discover that communion is not you reaching upward, but consciousness opening inward. In this understanding, the idea of separation quietly dissolves. The belief that you are a fragment, a struggling entity trying to attract divine attention, fades away. You begin to sense that the very capacity to be aware, to love, to hope, and to discern truth is evidence of an indwelling source. Communion is not a bridge between two distant points. It is the recognition that there was never a gap. As this realization dawns, effort loses its strain. You no longer try to force peace, because peace is revealed as the natural atmosphere of spiritual awareness. You no longer chase guidance, because guidance arises spontaneously when the mind is no longer crowded with fear and personal will. You begin to notice that answers appear when questions are released, and direction becomes clear when the need to control is surrendered. Communion with God is not emotional excitement, nor is it an escape from the world. It is the calm assurance that beneath every appearance there is an unchanging reality governing all things in harmony. When you understand this, you stop measuring your spiritual life by feelings or outcomes. You trust the invisible activity that is always at work, even when no visible change seems to occur. In this communion, you discover a new way of living with problems. Challenges no longer feel like punishments or obstacles meant to defeat you. They become invitations to rest more deeply in spiritual awareness. Instead of asking why something is happening, you begin to ask how truth can be realized here. And often, without struggle, the problem loses its authority, because it was sustained only by fear and false belief. You learn that communion is not about asking God to change circumstances, but about allowing consciousness to align with what is already true. From that alignment, circumstances adjust naturally. Healing in all its forms is revealed not as a miracle imposed from outside, but as the removal of mental resistance to harmony that was always present. As this understanding matures, your sense of identity changes. You stop defining yourself by past experiences, labels, or limitations. You begin to see yourself as an avenue through which divine qualities express themselves. Wisdom, compassion, strength, and clarity are no longer traits you try to develop. They are qualities you allow to flow. This changes the way you relate to others. Judgment softens, because you recognize that the same presence animating you is active in every life. Competition gives way to compassion, and comparison loses its grip. You no longer need to prove your worth, because worth is not something bestowed by the world. It is inherent in spiritual being. In true communion, silence becomes as meaningful as words. You learn to sit quietly, not waiting for a voice, but resting in awareness. In that stillness, the mind releases its habitual anxieties, and a deeper intelligence begins to operate. Decisions become simpler, not because life becomes easier, but because you are no longer trying to solve everything from a limited perspective. You begin to trust intuition without mystifying it. It is simply the natural movement of consciousness when it is not obstructed by fear. Guidance feels gentle, practical, and often ordinary. It does not demand attention, it invites cooperation. This understanding also transforms your relationship with time. You stop living in constant anticipation or regret. The present moment becomes sufficient, because it is recognized as the point of contact with divine reality. You discover that peace is not found in a future resolution, but in present awareness. Communion reveals that supply is not dependent on external conditions. You stop seeing life as a struggle for resources and begin to recognize an ever-present source of provision. This does not make you passive, it makes you receptive. Action becomes inspired rather than driven by anxiety, and effort flows instead of exhausting. Fear gradually loses its dominance, not because fear is fought, but because it is understood. You see that fear arises from the belief in separation, and as communion deepens, that belief weakens. Confidence emerges naturally, not as arrogance, but as quiet trust. You realize that communion is not fragile. It does not disappear when circumstances are difficult or when emotions fluctuate. It is not dependent on perfection. Even in moments of doubt, the presence remains unchanged. This realization brings forgiveness, especially toward yourself. Life begins to feel guided rather than random. You notice that encounters, opportunities, and even delays carry meaning. You stop forcing outcomes and start allowing unfoldment. Patience becomes easier because you trust the process that is greater than personal understanding. In this awareness, prayer changes its nature. It is no longer a request for intervention, but an acknowledgement of truth. Gratitude replaces pleading. Listening replaces repetition. And often, nothing needs to be said at all. You discover that communion is available in the midst of activity, not just in quiet moments. Whether working, speaking, or resting, there is an underlying awareness that does not leave you. Life becomes an expression of communion rather than a distraction from it. This understanding does not remove responsibility, it refines it. You become more attentive, more ethical, more loving, not from obligation, but from clarity. Actions align with inner truth, and integrity becomes natural. Over time, you notice a subtle joy that is not dependent on success or approval. It is a steady contentment rooted in knowing that you are upheld by something infinite and benevolent. Even when circumstances challenge you, this joy remains untouched. You begin to see that communion is not an achievement reached after long discipline, but a realization that unfolds as resistance falls away. Every moment of sincerity, humility, and willingness opens consciousness further. And perhaps the most profound change is this: you stop asking whether God is with you. Not as a belief, not as a doctrine, but as a lived awareness that quietly informs every thought, every action, every breath. Communion with God is not an act of reaching outward or upward, but an awakening to an ever-present inner reality that has never been separate from your own consciousness. True spiritual understanding dissolves fear and struggle by revealing that peace, guidance, and harmony are already active when personal effort and control are surrendered. Healing, direction, and supply unfold naturally when awareness aligns with spiritual truth rather than attempting to change outer conditions through force or anxiety. As communion deepens, identity shifts from limitation and self-definition to the recognition of divine qualities expressing effortlessly through daily life. Living in communion transforms every moment into quiet guidance, where trust replaces doubt, compassion replaces judgment, and life is experienced as divinely ordered rather than random. Communion with God is not a movement of thought reaching toward something distant, hidden, or higher than you. It is the awakening of consciousness to what has always been present, sustaining your very awareness of life. For many, spiritual effort begins with the assumption that God is somewhere else. That connection must be earned through discipline, words, or ritual. Yet this assumption itself creates the sense of distance that seems so difficult to overcome. When this belief gently falls away, communion is revealed not as an achievement, but as recognition. In this recognition, you begin to notice that awareness itself is the doorway. The fact that you can perceive, reflect, and discern truth is evidence of an inner presence that does not come and go. You are not creating communion in moments of prayer. You are becoming conscious of what prayer has always pointed toward. This realization softens striving and quiets the inner pressure to make something happen. Instead of asking how to reach God, you find yourself resting in the awareness that you are already within the atmosphere of divine being. As this understanding deepens, the mind gradually releases its habit of searching. Seeking implies absence, but recognition implies presence. You begin to see that every sincere desire for truth was itself the movement of God within you, drawing attention back to its own source. Communion, then, is not an event that occurs at special times, but a continuous state that becomes more apparent as resistance dissolves. This inner awareness does not announce itself with dramatic sensation. Often it appears as a gentle stillness beneath thought, a quiet assurance that does not argue or explain. You learn to trust this stillness not because it offers immediate answers, but because it reveals a stability that remains untouched by changing circumstances. In this stability, you begin to sense that life is not as fragile as fear once suggested. The realization that communion is inward changes the nature of a spiritual practice. Silence becomes more meaningful than repetition, and listening more powerful than asking. You discover that truth does not need to be persuaded to act. It only needs to be acknowledged. In that acknowledgement, the personal sense of will relaxes, allowing a deeper intelligence to operate through you. This does not mean withdrawing from life or responsibilities. On the contrary, recognizing communion as an inner reality brings clarity into daily living. Decisions feel less burdened by anxiety because they arise from a quieter mental atmosphere. You find yourself responding rather than reacting, guided by an inner sense of rightness rather than external pressure. As the belief in separation fades, fear begins to lose its foundation. Fear thrives on the idea that you are alone, unsupported, and responsible for controlling every outcome. Communion reveals that life is governed by a wisdom far greater than personal thought. Trust replaces strain, not through blind faith, but through lived experience of inner guidance. You also begin to understand that communion does not fluctuate with mood or circumstance. It is not lost in moments of doubt or difficulty. Even when the mind feels unsettled, the underlying presence remains unchanged. This realization brings compassion toward yourself, allowing you to release harsh self-judgment and unrealistic expectations. Over time, you recognize that every genuine insight, every moment of peace, has a reason from this inner source. You were never cut off from it, you were simply unaware of its constancy. Communion becomes less something you seek and more something you live from, shaping perception, action, and relationship in quiet but profound ways. In this awareness, the idea of reaching God dissolves entirely. There is only the deepening recognition that consciousness itself is the meeting place, and that what you once searched for outwardly has always been the life within you, waiting to be acknowledged and trusted. When spiritual understanding begins to unfold, one of the first changes you notice is the gradual release of struggle. Much of human effort is driven by the belief that peace, safety, and direction must be achieved through constant control. The mind learns to push, plan, and defend, assuming that without personal effort everything will collapse. Yet true understanding reveals that this tension is not strength, but resistance to an already active harmony. Fear thrives where control dominates. It convinces you that life is uncertain, that outcomes are fragile, and that mistakes are irreversible. Under this influence, even prayer becomes strained, turning into an attempt to persuade God to intervene. But as awareness deepens, you begin to see that fear is not a reality to be conquered, but a misunderstanding to be dissolved. It exists only as long as separation is believed to be true. Surrender does not mean resignation or passivity. It is the conscious release of the false belief that the personal mind is the source of intelligence and power. When this belief loosens, something unexpected happens. Clarity increases. You find that when you stop forcing answers, insight appears naturally. When you stop demanding certainty, guidance unfolds step by step. In this surrender, effort changes its quality. Instead of being fueled by anxiety, action becomes inspired. You still move, plan, and work, but without the inner pressure that once accompanied every decision. You begin to sense that you are cooperating with a deeper order rather than struggling against uncertainty. This cooperation brings a quiet confidence that does not depend on guarantees. As fear loses its grip, the body and mind respond. Tension eases, thought becomes clearer, and emotional reactions soften. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to appear manageable, sometimes even temporary. You realize that much of what you feared was sustained by constant mental rehearsal, not by actual conditions. When thought rests, the problem often weakens. You also discover that surrender opens the way for discernment. Without the noise of fear, you can recognize what truly needs attention and what can be released. You stop reacting to every appearance and start responding from inner awareness. This discernment is gentle but firm, guiding without urgency. One of the most profound shifts is the realization that you do not need to protect yourself from life. The belief that life is hostile dissolves as trust grows. You see that challenges are not evidence of abandonment, but opportunities to lean more deeply into spiritual awareness. Each time you release control, you strengthen trust. And each time you trust, fear has less authority. This understanding also reshapes your expectations. You stop measuring spiritual growth by constant ease or success. You recognize that peace is not the absence of challenge, but the absence of resistance. Even when circumstances remain unresolved, there is an inner stability that does not fluctuate. This stability becomes more valuable than quick solutions. Surrender allows patience to develop naturally. You no longer rush outcomes or force timing. You sense that unfoldment has its own rhythm, and interfering with it often delays clarity. Waiting no longer feels empty. It becomes an active state of listening. Gradually, struggle gives way to trust, not because life becomes predictable, but because you realize you are not navigating alone. Fear loses its voice as understanding grows, and what remains is a quiet assurance that harmony is not something to be created, but something to be allowed into conscious awareness as awareness aligns more consistently with spiritual truth. The way you understand healing, guidance, and supply begins to shift. What once appeared as external conditions that needed to be fixed, changed, or acquired is gradually seen as effects rather than causes. You realize that life is not responding to effort alone, but to the state of consciousness from which effort proceeds. When thought is anchored in fear or lack, experience tends to reflect that tension. When awareness rests in truth, harmony expresses itself without strain. Healing, in this light, is no longer a dramatic intervention imposed upon the body or circumstances. It is the natural outcome of removing false concepts that obscure what is already whole. You begin to see that discord persists only while it is mentally supported by belief, attention, and emotional reaction. As understanding deepens, these supports weaken, and harmony asserts itself quietly, sometimes without any noticeable struggle. The body, the mind, and even relationships respond to this shift because they are no longer governed by fear-based thought. Guidance follows the same principle. Instead of asking what you should do in a tone of uncertainty, you learn to listen from a place of trust. Direction does not come as overwhelming instruction, but as a simple sense of right movement. Often it is so natural that you barely recognize it as guidance at all. You find yourself choosing wisely without analyzing every possibility, because clarity arises from inner alignment rather than external pressure. This alignment also changes your experience of supply. The belief that good is limited and must be competed for gradually dissolves. You recognize that supply is not merely material, but an expression of intelligence, creativity, and order. Opportunities appear not because you force them into existence, but because consciousness is open to recognizing them. What you need arrives in forms that may differ from expectation, yet always in ways that support growth and balance. One of the most freeing realizations is that you are not responsible for making life work. This does not remove initiative, it removes burden. You still act, but action flows from inspiration rather than anxiety. You stop exhausting yourself trying to manage outcomes that were never yours to control. Instead, you learn to align thought with truth, and effects follow naturally. As this understanding becomes lived experience, impatience fades. You no longer demand immediate results as proof that something is working. You trust the unseen activity of spiritual law, even when appearances lag behind awareness. This trust prevents discouragement and keeps you from abandoning truth for quick but temporary solutions. You also notice that healing and supply are not personal possessions. They are expressions of universal harmony. This realization removes pride and fear equally. You do not take credit when things improve, and you do not condemn yourself when challenges appear. You remain anchored in the understanding that truth operates impartially and consistently. When alignment is maintained, even ordinary actions carry a sense of rightness. Work becomes less about survival and more about expression. Relationships feel less demanding because you are no longer asking others to supply what can only come from within. You give more freely, not because you have more, but because you trust the source. Difficult moments still arise, but they no longer dominate awareness. Instead of asking how to fix the problem, you ask how to remain aligned with truth in its presence. Often, this simple shift dissolves the problem's intensity. The situation may change slowly or quickly, but fear is no longer directing your response. Through this lived alignment, you begin to see that healing, guidance, and supply were never distant goals. They were always present as potential, waiting for consciousness to stop resisting them. waiting for thought to rest in truth rather than appearances, waiting for awareness to recognize that harmony does not need to be created, only allowed into experience through quiet trust and inner alignment with what is already eternally established. As spiritual awareness deepens, the sense of identity undergoes a quiet but profound transformation. You begin to notice that much of what you once called yourself was actually a collection of memories, roles, achievements, and fears. These elements felt solid only because they were repeatedly rehearsed in thought. When communion becomes a lived awareness, these definitions lose their authority, and a deeper sense of being emerges that is not dependent on history or circumstance. You no longer experience yourself as a personality struggling to become spiritual, but as consciousness through which spiritual qualities naturally express. This shift is subtle, yet it changes everything. Instead of trying to acquire patience, wisdom, or compassion, you begin to allow them. They appear not as personal virtues to be admired, but as natural expressions of an inner source that does not need development. The pressure to improve yourself gives way to the freedom of letting truth reveal itself. This new understanding brings gentleness toward your own growth. You stop demanding perfection from yourself and others. You recognize that growth unfolds as awareness deepens, not as effort intensifies. Mistakes lose their power to define you, because identity is no longer anchored in performance. You learn from experience without being imprisoned by it. As identity shifts, relationships change. You no longer approach others as mirrors reflecting your worth or as sources of fulfillment. You meet them as expressions of the same life you are learning to trust within yourself. This recognition softens judgment and dissolves comparison. Differences remain, but they no longer threaten. You listen more, react less, and find that understanding arises where conflict once dominated. This awareness also frees you from the burden of labels. Success and failure lose their ability to shape your sense of value. Praise does not inflate, and criticism does not diminish. You become less dependent on external validation because your sense of being is rooted in something stable and inwardly assured. Confidence emerges not as self-assertion but as quiet presence. As divine qualities express more freely, daily life becomes simpler. You find yourself responding with clarity rather than defensiveness, with compassion rather than impatience. These responses are not forced. They arise naturally when identity is no longer centered in fear. Even when emotions surface, they pass more quickly because they are no longer believed to be the truth of who you are. This shift in identity also reshapes purpose. You stop asking what you should become and begin to notice what is expressing itself through you. Work, creativity, and service take on new meaning. You are no longer trying to prove your worth through achievement. You are allowing life to express itself through meaningful contribution. Effort becomes joyful rather than exhausting. Challenges still appear, but they no longer threaten identity. You meet them with curiosity instead of resistance. Each challenge becomes an opportunity to notice where thought has slipped back into old definitions and to gently return to inner awareness. This process strengthens clarity rather than undermines confidence. As this understanding stabilizes, you realize that identity was never something to be built or protected. It was always something to be recognized. What remains is a sense of being that is quiet, expansive, and grounded, moving through life without needing constant affirmation, guided by an inner truth that expresses itself naturally as wisdom, compassion, and strength through every ordinary moment of living. Awareness as communion becomes a lived reality rather than a passing insight. Life begins to reveal itself as ordered rather than accidental. You notice that events are no longer interpreted as random occurrences happening to you, but as movements within a larger harmony that intelligence is quietly governing. This does not mean that everything appears pleasant or easy, but it does mean that nothing feels meaningless. Even interruptions and delays take on significance when viewed from inner awareness. Trust grows naturally in this atmosphere. You stop watching life with suspicion, waiting for something to go wrong. The constant inner scanning for danger or loss begins to fade because you recognize that guidance is active even when outcomes are uncertain. This trust is not naive optimism. It is grounded in repeated experience of being led, supported, and corrected without force. You begin to rely less on prediction and more on presence. Living in communion changes the way you meet each day. Instead of starting from anxiety or expectation, you begin from awareness. This awareness does not plan the entire future, but it informs the next step. You learn to value responsiveness over control, allowing life to unfold rather than attempting to script it. Decisions become lighter, and mistakes lose their sting because they are seen as part of a learning movement rather than personal failures. Compassion deepens as you recognize that everyone is navigating their own level of awareness. You no longer demand that others meet you at the same understanding. This removes much inner conflict and allows patience to develop. Forgiveness becomes easier, not because behavior is excused, but because you no longer see others as separate from the same life expressing through you. This way of living also refines discernment. You are less distracted by appearances and more attentive to inner resonance. Choices are made not by fear of loss or desire for approval, but by a sense of quiet rightness. Even when decisions are difficult, there is an underlying peace because you trust the source from which they arise. You begin to notice that life responds differently to you. Situations resolve with less friction, and when they do not, you remain steady. This steadiness becomes a silent influence on your environment. Others may sense it without understanding it, responding to the calm you carry rather than the words you speak. Living from communion does not remove individuality, it refines it. Your uniqueness expresses itself more clearly when it is not distorted by fear or self-doubt. Creativity flows more freely and service becomes more authentic. You give not to be needed, but because giving feels natural and unforced. There is also a deepening humility in this awareness. You recognize that wisdom is not personal property. Insight comes and goes, and you learn to remain open rather than attached to understanding. This humility keeps awareness fresh and prevents spiritual experience from becoming rigid or self-important. Over time, communion ceases to feel like something you practice and becomes the atmosphere in which you live. You are no longer concerned with maintaining it or losing it. You simply notice when thought drifts and gently return to inner awareness. Life becomes less about managing circumstances and more about abiding in truth. In this way of living, even ordinary moments carry depth. Walking, working, listening, and resting are no longer distractions from spiritual life. They are expressions of it. There is a quiet confidence that whatever unfolds will be met with guidance, clarity, and balance, because life is no longer approached as a personal struggle, but as a divinely ordered movement in which you are consciously participating through trust, awareness, and daily surrender to inner truth. When all of this is gathered into lived understanding, what remains is a quiet certainty that life is not asking you to become something greater, but to recognize what has always been true. Communion is no longer an idea, a practice, or a moment you try to reach. It is the silent foundation of your being. From this awareness, effort softens, fear loses authority, and trust becomes natural. You move through life less concerned with outcomes and more attentive to inner alignment, knowing that harmony unfolds from consciousness, not control. What once felt like a search ends in recognition, and living itself becomes the expression of an ever-present divine reality, gently guiding, sustaining, and revealing itself through every moment of awareness.